Semester in the main Junck Colloquium series, and all of you have been here before, but also see some new faces, including a visitor from Croatia, listener, so welcome. And I think all of you are on the list, sir, so you do have information about the talks. If you're not, if you'd like to be added to the list, please let me know. First of all, I need to apologize. I've already been given some dirty looks and where the cookies, there's drinks, and it's mea culpa. So I just completely lost track of the fact that we're actually starting today and forgot to get those ordered, forgot to inform either Brett or Jessica. So they obviously didn't want to get it without speaking to me, so I apologize for that. And since we decided to cancel the consultation with Anne and Rhonda, we will not be having a talk again until the 19th because Walden was supposed to arrange one for next week, and that didn't happen, so we decided to cancel that. And then on the 12th, we have the PhD art interviews, and many of you will be involved with that, and so we decided not to have one. So we will have a 3-week gap after today's talk, but after that, we're going to have pretty much a regular schedule, and we have like 10 people scheduled for the rest of the semester. 5 eminent scholars from UNC, including 2 from our own school, Brian Johnston and Dr. Dan Rife, and 3 other eminent scholars, including today's speaker, Dr. Joanne Hershfield from UNC, and then 5 other speakers from different departments and colleges and universities from around the country. And together again, we're trying to maintain our goal of making it as truly interdisciplinary as possible. So we do have a rich series of topics and subjects being presented. So thank you all for coming. Please feel free to pass on the word to your friends, your peers, your students in other classes as well. But without much further ado, our speaker for today is Dr. Joanne Hershfield, and we have one of her dear friends and colleagues from many years ago, to go back a long way, and Dr. Lucilla Vargas is going to introduce her.
Okay, yes, Joanne and I went to the same PhD program at UT Austin. That's why I have the honor to introduce her now. And we have been friends since then, and then we came together here. One thing is that the program there was radio, television, and film. So it's a broader program because it included film. And Joanne is now professor and chair of the curriculums in women's studies. She completed her master's degree at Stanford University in film production and received her PhD in film studies at UT Austin. She's the author of several books. She has so many. One is Mexican Cinema, Mexican Women, and it covers from 1940 to 1950. The second one is The Invention of Dolores del Rio, Imagining, and the third one, which is the topic of her talk today, her most recent book is Imagining la Chica Moderna, Women, Nation, and Visual Culture in Mexico, 1970 to 1940. She's also co-editor of Mexico's Cinema, A Century of Film and Filmmakers. In addition to that, she is a documentary filmmaker, and she has several documentaries. More recent, she concluded a film. The title is Men Are Women, Men Are Human, Women Are Buffalo. So complicated. That takes a look at violence against women in Thailand. And the second one is the Gillian film, which is a moving portrait of an exceptional young woman who works at a local veterinary clinic, rides horses, takes dance classes, and is developmentally disabled. When Gillian decides to move out of the house, her mother must come to terms with letting go. And I know Gillian very well. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lucilla. And I'd like to thank Professor Kali Marama.
Just call me Sri.
And Barbara Friedman for inviting me to speak today. And also, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to come here and speak. My presentation today emerges out of my most recent book, Imagining la Chica Moderna, Women, Nation, and Visual Culture in Post-Revolutionary Mexico, 1917 to 1936. In this work, I consider the appearance of modern femininity in the everyday life of post-revolutionary culture in Mexico. Most histories about Mexico's post-revolutionary political, cultural, and social transformations are concerned with the creation of the modern Mexican state and the institutionalization of a post-revolutionary brand of nationalism. They rely on written historical evidence housed in official state and private archives, presidential papers, official edicts and proclamations, letters from one political official to another, records of licenses, marriages, divorce, and deaths. Theorists of nationalism have for most part been gender blind in their analysis of nationalisms. The understanding of history as primarily political history has ignored histories of gender and the role of everyday practice in the formation of new national and social identities. Recent feminist work on Mexican women during the revolutionary and post-revolutionary period, roughly 1910 through 1936, focuses for the most part on relations between women and social and political projects carried out by the state and other social institutions, such as the Catholic Church and labor organizations. Other studies examine women's participation in the Mexican Revolution as soldaderas, soldiers, women soldiers, their involvement in national and regional post-revolutionary political movements, and in health and education projects. They look at women in factories, agricultural work, and as well, they look at prostitutes on the streets of Mexico City. Recently, scholars have turned to culture as a site of mediation in the construction of Mexican nationalism, recognizing that contemporary national projects are intricately bound up with 20th century consumer culture and with everyday practice of ordinary citizens. While acknowledging the political and the economic, these studies situate cultural practices and processes at the center of their narratives rather than at the periphery. Yet, like more traditional histories, these newer cultural histories are mostly concerned with the role of culture in the formation and affirmation of Mexicanidad, a term given to describe an official post-revolutionary Mexican national identity produced through concerted political efforts. Like all contemporary national identities, this one was denoted by a set of prescripts that included a common history connecting the past to the present, and monuments and festivals commemorating that past, a national language and a set of national values, and such cultural objects and practices as songs, dances, and costumes. Conventional political history draws a picture in which the state, the market, and modern cultural institutions operated in tandem to create a modern citizen. While there were mutually supportive and beneficial relationships between governmental and political formation and processes and cultural market-driven practices, there were also unavoidable tensions. These were triggered by the conflict between two ideologies that can be defined as the ideology of collectivism on the part of the state versus the ideology of individualism on the part of market forces. Popular culture negotiated this divide, drawing on existing practices.
Please, can I ask you a question? Is that okay?
Oh, yes.
How exactly are you conceptualizing the distinction between collectivism and individualism in this context?
Pardon me?
The distinction between collectivism and individualism, how exactly are you conceptualizing that?
Well, the project of the post-revolutionary nation was, in a sense, to create the Mexican national citizen with a Mexican national identity. Before the revolution, Mexico, to large intensive purposes, did not exist. There was Mexico City, which was the center. The people's allegiances were to regional linguistic affiliations. And so one of the goals of the Mexican post-revolutionary successive regimes was to bring these diverse groups together by promoting a collective identity of mexicanidad. Popular culture negotiated this divide, drawing on existing practices and ideologies, while at the same time producing new ones. It's precisely this heterogeneity that allows popular culture to address the dreams and desires of diverse audiences, even as it is absorbed into national hegemonic projects. Popular culture, broadly understood to encompass all aspects of material culture and practices that are part of people's everyday lives, is a crucial source for understanding the often marginalized position of women. While I agree with Henry Lefebvre that everyday life weighs heaviest on women, I take issue with his assertion that women, as he says, are the subject of everyday life and its victims. I would argue that gender is a significant variable in the analysis of everyday life. All subjects, regardless of their gender, are subjects and victims of the everyday. However, given the socio-political constraints placed on women in terms of their participation in the public sphere at this moment in Mexican history, the everyday is a particularly important space to examine the social construction of gender and the ways in which women actively respond to and engage with those constraints, both in the private sphere of the home as well as in the public sphere. Those issues delegated to the private or women's sphere, such as fashion, homemaking, and children, were central to the formation of women's identity during this formative moment in Mexican history. In this sense, the production, circulation, and use of popular culture must be understood to be just as political as issues of suffrage, education, and working outside the home. In using the term political, I'm not suggesting that the formation of La Chica Moderna was in any sense a hegemonic project directed by the state in concert with capitalist enterprises. In fact, I do not consider the policies of successive post-revolutionary regimes at all, except where they intersect with or take part in popular practices. Instead, in order to understand the political nature of gender in the cultural construction of national and social identities, I examine popular visual culture. I concentrate primarily on images published in illustrated magazines, in daily newspapers, and reproduced in Mexican films, and other pictorial illustrations that appeared in a variety of genres, as well as other forms of popular visual culture that circulated in the cities, towns, and villages of Mexico during the 2 decades that followed the end of the military aspect of the Mexican Revolution. I suggest that Mexican women became modern not simply through the rhetoric of nationalism and an imagined conception of community, but also through their participation in transnational gendered commercial discourses and practices of everyday life. My focus on popular images of embodied gender is intended to emphasize the place and importance of the visual in the project of modernization in Mexico. The dispersion of various forms of visual culture that cross social, cultural, and economic borders reveals the diverse range of meanings in regards to La Chica Moderna that were available to many different audiences in Mexico, not just those who lived in the sprawling neighborhoods of Mexico City. By the 1920s, the material culture of the global marketplace was spreading across the nation, addressing women in Guadalajara, Merida, and Veracruz. The images I look at were public and popular, reproduced mechanically and widely circulated. They were an assortment of national, local, and familiar, as well as transnational and unfamiliar. In general, the production and use of these images were governed by institutional parameters, those of mass publishing, for example, and by popular aesthetic practices and genres. Some were addressed directly to women through advertisements, and as illustrations accompanying articles in women's magazines and on the women's pages in the variety of daily newspapers. Others illustrated domestic and international news stories, promoted tourism, advertised the latest Mexican and Hollywood films, and adorned the bodies of female movie stars in popular films and in stories about their lives. My study of popular images is not intended to show how people actually live their lives. Instead, I offer an analysis of the production of ideas about the new post-revolutionary Mexican woman as she was envisioned in popular culture, and consider how those images contributed to an understanding of Mexican modernity. Visual culture may be defined as those material artifacts, buildings, images, plus time-based media performances produced by human labor, by human imagination, which serve as aesthetic, symbolic, ritualistic, or ideological political ends and are practical functions, and most importantly, address the sense of sight. While the study of visual culture emerged in the discipline of art history, scholars in diverse fields such as anthropology, geography, history, and media studies have more recently taken this term to mean most any kind of human-made material artifact that serves aesthetic or practical functions, that is mass-produced or made within an art or craft context. The primary consideration, however, is that such artifacts address the sense of sight. As many have argued, vision was central to modern social and subjective formations. In fact, the modern world can be defined in part by proliferation of images that flow across geographic, linguistic, temporal, cultural, and technological borders. Imagining La Chica Moderna is interested in what Catherine Sheffield calls the intended reading situation for women. It begins from an assumption that consumption is above all a social practice. As she reminds us, we cannot know with any degree of certainty how historically distant readers read. If the materials historical readers engaged with are somehow textually available to us today, what is not accessible are those historically distant readers themselves, aside from whatever evidence may survive in letters, diaries, or essays, of how they experienced their lives, their personal and cultural histories, or their engagement with the text they read. While Shevlov acknowledges that there must have been readers, both men and women, who read against the grain, the best that contemporary critics can confirm from the textual remnants that remain are areas of possible reading positions available to those readers. Thus, an understanding of what kind of interpretations women made of the popular images they encountered daily can only be indirectly construed through an analysis of the images within the context of available reading strategies structured through public discourses. I'd like to move on to some of the images that I looked at in the book and talk a little bit about those and how I read those. La Chica Moderna, pictured in this first picture up here, is probably quite familiar to you. She shares a number of qualities with modern women in Europe and the United States in the 1920s. She's up to date in her appearance, her dress, and her attitudes. At home, she wears mass-produced house dress covered by apron. In the evening, she favors slinky black evening dresses, New York and Paris fashions that barely covered her knees, and French berets that snugly fit her short new bob. She is middle class, tall and slender. She smokes cigarettes and wears makeup. She is the personification of feminine elegance and Parisian chic. This resemblance can be linked to the transnational distribution of the ideologies and commodities of fashion and style. While images of La Chica Moderna were produced and consumed within the complex context of powerful and strongly voiced nationalistic discourses during that post-revolutionary moment. Their presentational iconography was specifically that of global modernity. I begin by asking, in what way does this advertisement for the Cigarra Mexicana Claveles, this second image right here, function as an historical document? For Roland Marchand, advertisements cannot be taken as an authoritative evidence of the idea of those who heard or read them. Instead, they may be understood as traces, glimpses, or indication of popular attitudes and social realities. They do reveal what products and services were sold during a given era, when new products first attained mass distribution, and what explanations and suggestions were offered for their use. The Claveles argument that includes an image of a Mexican flaperista informs us, for example, that cigarette smoking was an activity that was promoted to Mexican women in the 1920s, and that advertisers imagined the modern Mexican woman smoked and bobbed her hair. We can also see that the Mexican advertisement industry utilized global understandings of modern femininity, and that international design practices in its marketing campaigns addressed to women. An analysis of the advertisement cannot, however, tell us what individual women thought of the flaperista. At most, this ad reveals cultural ideas about gender rather than a social history of Mexican consumers. So my analysis does not intend to show how people actually lived their lives, used specific commodities, or reveal what they thought of the changes affecting their world. The book focuses on a number of themes. I look at fashion, I look at the promotion of domesticity, and I look at the theme of exoticism, for example. Today I'm going to focus just on one piece of that, and I'm going to look at images of women at work. If images of fashionable women emphasize emphasize beauty, clothing, grace, maternity, sexuality, and consumption, pictures of working women call attention to the fact that many women of all ages and social rank worked outside of the home. Photographs and paintings of working women pictured the kinds of labor they performed, the spaces in which they performed that labor, suggested the age and economic class of these workers, and suggested how female laborers were viewed by culture at large. How was work gendered in these images? How did images of working women challenge or sustain dominant understandings of womanhood and femininity? In what way did representations of women at work shape the beliefs about working women in post-revolutionary Mexico? The issue of women in work in post-revolutionary Mexico is central to recent feminist historiography. These studies look at specific case studies to illuminate the role of women in wage labor and find that women's ability to earn wages altered their social status as well as perceptions about that status. The lives of working women were shaped by and in turn shaped the interconnections among the various spheres and material conditions of their lives that include family, class, citizenship, as well as employment. First, economic independence meant that a woman did not have to necessarily rely on husbands or fathers to support her and her children. Second, transformation of work and workspaces meant that women's access to the public sphere expanded. Industrialization and the introduction of new occupations for women also brought significant changes to the gendering of workspace in Mexico and aggravated social concerns about working women that were linked to the idea of the separate spheres of home and work. For example, with the introduction of department stores and the expansion of retail outlets, more and more women found jobs as sales clerks that required them to interact on a daily basis with people outside of their own social class. Although the Mexican Revolution produced new political rights for women, it did not totally dispel earlier ideas about the gendered nature of private and public life. Critics representing religious and middle-class constituents condemned the entrance of women, specifically middle-class women, into the workforce, insisting that a woman's place was in the home. Discursive constructions of working women in Mexico were still tied to class, to ideals of femininity, and to the ideological distinction between public and private spheres. Regardless of the dominant discourse of domesticity, national, regional, and individual economic imperatives required that many women enter the wage labor market. If the ideal was a two-parent household in which men worked for a wage and women took care of home and family, the reality was that in many households, men were absent, women worked for remuneration, and took care of their home and children. And children themselves were often officially or unofficially working for wages. The visual representation of working women carried out a task, a similar task as other images. Lower class women working in factories as domestics or selling tortillas on the street corner, and women engaged in what was deemed professional work, professors, doctors, and librarians, for example, were imagined as workers in very different ways, as evidenced by a discussion of the two images that I've produced up here for you. This difference had to do with cultural conceptions about the relationship between class and gender, but also related to conventionally held ideas about the kinds of work that women did in exchange for money. On the other hand, these representations also challenge conservative notions of femininity and conceptualization of the gender of work and workers. In other words, visual culture made working women in their lives visible to the community in which they labored. Images of women at work gave evidence of women's participation in the public arena of economic activity in the face of a conventional ideology that painted a picture of separate spheres. These two images, one a photograph of two typists being timed by a male supervisor, the other a tinted photograph, which is actually a postcard, a photograph of a group of lavanderas mexicanas, or Mexican laundresses, reproduces a postcard for circulation in the tourist trade, are example of how women's labor was imagined in Mexican visual culture. Although they are both representation of obreras, or women workers, the two images differ in a number of ways. The photograph of the typist appears to imagine clerical work as middle class, evidenced by the dress, body type, and demeanor of the models. The typists are about the same age, in their 20s or so, and they wear the typical dress worn by millions of women clerical workers around the world. They sport the flapperistas bobbed hairstyle and stylish high-heel, mass-produced shoes. They're both operating a mechanical writer, as the typewriter was called in those days, the new typewriting machine that helped transform the role of the secretary from a male-gendered position to a female one. The aesthetic of the composition is documentary in style, as if the photographer merely happened upon them in the midst of important work. The image of her infers the typists are busy and that time is of the essence. The two young women ignore the camera and appear to be totally focused on their work. And finally, the space in which they labor is characterized as modern by the furniture, the lighting, and the mechanical typewriting machines. The lavanderas, on the other hand, range in age from teenagers to grandmothers, and their dress is a mixture of the traditional and the contemporary. Their long hair is worn braided according to long established custom. They sit motionless, pose before the camera as if their work is not that important and can be suspended while their photograph is taken. Their bodies are turned to the front as they give the photographer their undivided attention, and they gaze directly into the camera lens. The working space is obviously not modern. The lavanderas kneel on the floor. There are no mechanical or electrical machines anywhere in sight, and the washing of clothes is presented as work done by lower class women. Another important distinction has to do with the difference in the context of the production and circulation of each image. The photograph of the typist illustrates an article about modern office work and is addressed to a literate, middle-class Mexican audience that subscribes to one of the major weekly illustrated magazines distributed in Mexico City. The images of the laundresses, conversely, is reproduced as a postcard intended to be circulated as a tourist travel souvenir. If the content and formal composition of the first photo is influenced by the realist aesthetics of photojournalism, the second image is informed by a different aesthetic, informed by a 19th century European imagination of an exotic otherness. And in another part of the book, I talk about this reproduction of domestic exoticness, the way in which Mexico used the exotic images of Mexican people as they were invented by European photographers and travelers primarily in the 19th century. But despite the aesthetic and textual differences, both photographs acknowledge the presence of women in the public arena of economic activity and reveal the gendered nature of work. Images of domestic and fashionable women again emphasize beauty, clothing, grace, maternity, and sexuality. Pictures of working women call attention to the fact that women also worked outside the home. In Mexico, as another national context, the gendering of the workspace was shaped by particular socio-cultural conceptions about femininity. For example, cigarette companies such as El Buen Tono employed women because in Mexico, cigarette manufacturing was historically considered women's work. El Buen Tono promoted itself as a workspace that, quote, protected worker morality, which included separation of the sexes, thereby making it an acceptable place for women. The advertisement of the U.S. cigarette Monte Carlo and the postcard depicting coffee sorters up here reproduces this ideology by presenting tobacco leaf and coffee, Well, I'll talk about this one first. This is just another example of women working in cigarette manufacturing. This one is coffee producing. Although coffee sorting had traditionally been seen as women's work, when the coffee manufacturing process was mechanized, men took on the skilled work of machinists, carpenters, and loaders, while women were hired as sorters, work that was considered unskilled and worth less in terms of wages. Not only do the images picture tobacco and coffee sorters as women's work, the space of this labor is also gendered female. Both spaces are imagined as workspaces occupied primarily by women. The photograph of the Mexican coffee sorters and the tobacco workers paints a picture of a feminized working space in which men do not figure at all, or only peripherally. The space of this work is thus made safe for the working woman. The single male coffee sorter in the postcard, you can see him up here in that corner, is presented in a feminized position. He's gay. Let's see, this one right here. He's the only one seated while the women are standing. The other male figure is distinguished by his hat and the fact that he is not engaged in manual labor. Instead, he stands off to the side, observing in the role of a supervisor or foreman. If the majority of representations of working women situated them with the relative safety of a gendered workspace, such as the factory, the shop, or the office, there were two kinds of women workers that occupied the public space of the street city: the prostitute and the vendedora, or street vendor. Those are some more images of seamstresses. The vendedoras, or street vendors, have a long history of working in public spaces in Mexico City. Even with the establishment of official municipal markets, many street vendors, both female and male, could not afford the rental rates of market stalls or the taxes and fees imposed by the city. They sold their wares, garden produce, handmade pottery, and textiles on familiar street corners where their customers knew where to find them. The majority were from the lower class, predominantly Indian or mixed class races, and many came into the city daily or weekly from outlying areas. Photographs of vendedoras reproduced on postcards and addressed to tourists were generally situated in picturesque contexts, sometimes reconstructed in a studio setting, but often shot in the actual space in which the work was conducted. Who were these women? Since they were not included in official surveys and national census data, the images of women selling tortillas and tomatillos are perhaps the only information we might find that could answer the question above. The three vendedoras de gorditas, in this figure here, display their goods on the cobblestones of an unnamed street. Dressed in the traditional rebosos, they are surrounded with other pieces of their lives, including handmade baskets and water jugs. Given the range of ages the three women seem to represent, they could be grandmother, daughter, and granddaughter. Why were these images of lower class street vendors such a popular subject for photographers and painters? One answer may be that they were the most visible challenge to the notion of the ideal separate spheres that pervaded understandings of gendered social roles. Female factory workers remained hidden behind the walls of factory. Seamstresses who took in piecework were safely ensconced in their homes. Vendedoras, however, plied their trade in the street, supposedly the place that men inhabited when they went out to work or to participate in civic life. The other response, of course, is that it was more acceptable to see lower class women at work than it was to see las mujeres decentes, or middle class women, laboring in the public sphere, indicating that class played a major role in the public's perception of working women, and that the majority of women who worked were already marginalized by class. These images of working women reveal the ways in which culture contained women within traditional notions of femininity, while celebrating modern ideals of independence and self-determinations. There is no doubt that women's lives were transformed by social and political processes brought about by the Mexican Revolution, the ensuing national projects enacted by the state, and by women themselves who participated in these processes. At the same time, I have argued that women's lives were radically changed by the ubiquitous and often unruly forces of popular visual culture. Along with images of happy housewives and fashionable flaperistas, women marching for birth control and national suffrage, photographs of female criminals, beauty queens, teachers, doctors, and seamstresses circulated in magazines, newspapers, and promotional materials. A glance at some of these images of real women revealed that they were not that different from the repertoire of manufactured images discussed in the preceding chapters. A story in the Mexican Weekly Ilustrado about women incarcerated in a women's prison in Mexico City features a photograph of Maria Elena Valladares, this woman here, who killed her lover in the corridors of the penitentiary. Dressed like Marlene Dietrich, Maria Elena makes a fashion statement. She wears a pair of men's trousers, a short button jacket, and a striped tie knotted off to one side. A jaunty cap is pulled down over her forehead, hiding her hair, and a fringed scarf is wrapped loosely around her neck. Relaxed as she poses with one leg bent against a stone wall. With her hands tucked into the pockets of her trousers, she resembles a young man waiting on the street corner for a friend or a lover to appear. In another issue of Illustrato, a young woman with a cloche hat perched jauntily on her bobbed hair and a boa draped over her shoulder smiles into the camera. This photograph accompanies a story about a woman who hired an assassin to murder her husband. She is described in the caption as a criminal wife, smiling and happy. Visual representations of La Chica Moderna evidence Mexico's attempt to deal with the challenges and uncertainty of profound social and cultural changes in the decades following the Mexican Revolution. While the consumption of visual iconography of modernity in the form of advertising, photography, and motion pictures needs to be situated within the specific historical condition of post-revolutionary cultural and social politics, the production of this iconography must be understood as a global phenomenon linked to global notions of modern identity. Thank you. Well, I'd be happy to take questions and comments.
Your remark about the Mexican artists' renditions of characters created in Europe or personalities. Expand on that a bit.
Well, a lot of photographers from Europe and the United States traveled to Mexico in the late 19th century and early 20th century and took pictures of Mexico that then were often used to illustrate books about Mexico or were transformed into postcards. And generally the images that they took were of the Indians.
Is that what you meant by exotic?
Right.
You used the word exotic.
Right. By using the word exotic, I'm referring to this notion of exoticizing particular bodies, making them strange or different. So in Europe, oftentimes you see postcards contain these images of the natives or the local people in their native dress in British colonies and French colonies, as well as from Mexico and other parts of Latin America, circulating as postcards or travel books. And these were meant to inform European American audiences about the other. So that's why I refer to them through this discourse of exoticism.
So it's a colonial discourse.
A colonial discourse, yes. I mean, there was no postcards of, women working in the Senate or women teaching dressed in Western clothes. It was a colonialist discourse. And in one of my chapters, I talk about, everybody knows of Frida Kahlo and the way in which she dressed as a Tehuana Indian. And in Mexico in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, a lot of upper class women and artists dressed in this exotic clothing, in sense producing a kind of domestic exoticism, appropriating the discourse of domesticity for their own use, sometimes for political. So Frida said she was aligning herself with the rights of the Indians, but sometimes it was just a fashion statement. A few years ago, when Frida was really popular here in the United States, women in New York City would, go in and have their hair done and their eyebrows not plucked so that they would look like Frida, or, wear clothing that resembled the kind of clothing that Frida wore. Yes?
Sort of along those same lines, we were talking about colonialism, but did you find in your examination of these images that, basically a two-part question, one, that they varied at all based on whether the intended audience was tended to be more male, more female, or mixed out of various sources, and two, I guess, whether the representations of femininity differed strongly along the lines of whether they were showing Mayan indigenous people or more European mestizo women, whether there's sort of like a class ethnicity separation.
By showing, you mean representing, or do you mean that they were addressed to Mayan?
Yeah, well, in this case, representing.
Okay.
Actually, the first part was more about whether it was the intended audience of men versus women, or mixed audience.
It varied. I mean, I found images in national newspapers that everybody read, but most of the images of women were in the women's pages of those newspapers. So that would say that they were addressed to women. And they were also women's magazines. We had Vogue and those kinds of things, and they were both European and American magazines, as well as Mexican magazines for women. But they were also in the general pages of a Mexico City daily newspaper. You'd find an advertisement for some kind of cleaning product, and it would be a news page or something, and then it would picture a woman. It's also interesting that even if some of these images were promoting modern things like mattresses, I found a number of these kinds of images where they would use the figure of a woman dressed in a traditional Indian costume promoting Simmons mattress. So it wasn't always the modern woman promoting the modern commodity. Yes?
So, remind me, the years you were looking at were 1917 through 33?
36.
36. And so, and you've got postcards and advertisements from magazines and news photographs. What was your strategy for choosing images that would be analyzed?
I wanted to look at a wider range of promotional materials. So advertisements, I looked at tourist promotions. I also looked at images, for example, in fashion magazines they weren't advertisements, but they were just promoting the newest fashion. So they accompanied a story about fashion or about decorating your home. These last two images, well, this one was a photograph that illustrated a news story. So I tried to find as wide a variety of the kinds of materials, rather than just only focusing on advertisements or only focusing on photographs. I looked at, at that period, most of the national newspapers were produced in Mexico City, but I also looked at magazines and newspapers that were produced in regional areas such as Guadalajara and Merida. Another thing we have to remember that at this point in Mexico there was a very high rate of illiteracy. So, people, a huge segment of population didn't read, but they could look at pictures. And many of these circulated nationally, even if the people couldn't read.
Did you find images produced by the Mexican government?
Yes, but I didn't focus on national images because I wanted to look at primarily the commodification of modern identity. So a lot of people, for example, have looked at the muralists and for example, there was I think it was in the 1920s, there was a beauty pageant to find the most beautiful India Bonita in Mexico. And that was sponsored by the government as well as, I think might have been Universal, one of the big Mexican newspapers. But I didn't look at official.
Right, right. Yeah, but the government has been a big advertiser, but still it is an official image.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, I'm very interested in your research. It reminds me to think about the 3 decades before. Before in China, our dress and such like eyebone, makeup or hair changed a lot. It's very interesting it's really interesting of this research. And I think maybe there is another product of you, of this research. Maybe you can be a specialist in a false thing, another decade of the fashion trend. Yes, my question is, you said your aim of this research is to offer an analysis of the production of idea about the news, but I'm not very understand about that. Could you explain more?
Well, as I mentioned, a lot of these images were, they were global. So these same images were circulating all around the world. In Japan, in Europe, in the United States, in India, in big cities everywhere. And they were all the same image. So they were, in a sense, this global notion of the new woman. And so what I wanted to do was to look and see how these new globally produced images helped contribute to the notion of the new Mexican woman that was being produced at this moment. New nations, and many have argued that the post-revolutionary Mexican nation was a new nation, need new kinds of citizens. In this case, they needed modern citizens. As I mentioned, there's a high rate of illiteracy. Most people still worked in agricultural work. The modern Mexican nation needed to industrialize. They needed more industrial workers. They needed more people living in the cities. They needed better educated people. They needed a new citizen from that which had existed before the revolution. And really, if you look at advertising in general, one of its function is to produce the new. New products need to be sold. New identities need to be promoted through fashion and through, new kinds of phones. I'm old-fashioned because I just have an old Palm. I don't have one of the newest Blackberries or anything, so I'm old. I'm not new. You still have the. You've not. You're in the 19th century. And there's been a lot of work done on modernity in China, the modern woman in China, in Japan, Germany, United States. So, in many ways, I'm borrowing from that literature. But any work that you do has to be historically and socially contextualized. As I argue in the book, the Mexican flapperista was not just a European or American flapper that spoke Spanish.
What were the other themes or domains that you look at?
Fashion, and there I look at the influence of mass-produced fashion. You know, in the 1920s, we see that, you know, the mass production in clothes, so that people all around the world could buy the same dress out of Sears catalog. And I look at the way in which movie stars are used to promote fashion. I also look at exotic fashion, you know, exoticism. And then I have a chapter on domesticity. So I look at the way in which you know, new technology is promoted, new kinds of kitchens. So the kitchen changed. The kitchen, you know, in Mexico was you know, often outdoors, or it was in a room with fire on the floor and cooking pots over it. And now the modern kitchen had refrigerators and electric stoves. And many of these, the earliest ones just promoted, let's say the ones in the early 20s, it was just an image of the new stove or the new refrigerator. But by the late 20s, it wasn't just, they weren't just selling the product, because there was this image of a modern woman standing at the stove, and she had on a Sears Roebuck dress and an apron, and her hair was perfectly coiffed, and she was cooking. So it wasn't just selling a product, it was promoting a new way of being for women.
It strikes me that listening to you that not too far out of the same period, these days Opera had Carmen, and she certainly, well, she worked in the cigarette factory. And at Strauss, I'm thinking about the equivalents in opera where, and Strauss's Salome and so forth, a little bit before this, but not too far before this, they must have created a sensation when they were presented.
Well, I'm sure you could do, you know, the same kind of study of the modern women in 17th century France, and this kind of work has been done. You know, modern doesn't just mean 20th century, so yeah, Carmen and these kinds of figures.
You don't make any distinctions in terms of race. You talk about class, but not race.
In my piece on exoticism and also on work, I talk about race and class together.
Were either of these women convicted of those crimes you cited?
Well, this woman was already in prison when she killed her lover, so I don't know what she was in prison for.
And Frida used to dress like that.
Yeah, she used to dress like a man. We only see pictures of her generally dressed in the clothes of the Indian woman, but she also dressed as a man. So.
Yeah, but that suggests that it wasn't only Frida.
Right.
And this woman, that there were many other.
Right. Marlene Dietrich, you know.
Sure.
Okay, well, thank you very much.